I am Mary Sketch with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and I am for the soil to protect the landscapes, waterways, and resources that provide the food that we all eat and the lands that we recreate on for current and future generations.
It is with great pleasure we welcome you to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and Mary Sketch Bryant and Eric Benfelt will be joining us in just a few moments with a special guest who has a lot of knowledge about water resources and soil health, and that episode will be coming up in just a few moments. But wanted to take just a moment before we get started today and remind you about the website forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4, thesoil.org. You'll find a lot of new tips and resources available at the website. Videos from Virginia Cooperative Extension, from all over the place, numerous resources, and also wanted to remind you about the 4 core principles of soil health that we always want to remember: to keep the soil covered if possible, minimize soil disturbance, maximize living roots, and energize with diversity. We go much more in depth at the website forthesoil.org. You'll learn a lot there. Tips and resources, and also a good place to find this very podcast. And speaking of which, let's get right to it. Welcome, everyone, to For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension, Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition are joining us today, along with a very special guest. Eric, would you introduce our guest today?
Yes, Jeff. We're very pleased to have Dr. Ryan Stewart with us. He's an associate professor at Virginia Tech in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences. His background and expertise in soil hydrology and water resource management. And we're very pleased to have Ryan with us. And Ryan, one question that we'd like to ask is a little bit about your history and your background and what got you interested in soils and agriculture and soil health.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Jeff and Mary, for being here with me today. And so I'd say my path to agriculture and working in soil health is definitely a bit of a windy one. So I know these days, whenever I talk to students and they tell me they don't know what they want to do when they grow up or with their lives, I tell them that's great. That's the best position to be in my opinion, because I didn't know what I wanted to do either. So I did my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and wasn't necessarily thrilled with what the job options looked like, and ended up stumbling into a job at a wastewater treatment plant. And that got me interested in water resources. And at first I thought maybe I wanted to build wastewater treatment plants and design them. But in the meantime, I got married, and my wife and I quit our jobs, rode our bikes across the country, and went to Bolivia in the Peace Corps for 2 years. And so I worked in basic sanitation in a rural village, training people on sanitation, designing some water systems, doing rainwater catchment. And this got me really interested in, just thinking about sustainable water management, sustainable management of natural resources. And so when we came back to the U.S., I looked for graduate programs where I could work in water resources in some capacity, and ended up doing a master's degree at Oregon State University, where I worked on with a wastewater treatment plant where they were trying to land apply treated wastewater. And that really got me thinking about soil infiltration, what happens to water when it goes into the ground and where it ends up and how long it takes to get there and all sorts of things like that. And then I started on a PhD working with the hydrology of these shrink swell soils, if you've ever seen them, that form big cracks when they're dry, and then they seal up and they become completely different soils when they're wet. And so trying to understand what was going on there. And I was working, our main field site was down in Chile. We were working in this area where historically they grew a lot of wheat, but there was this change in land use to a lot of planted pine and eucalyptus forest. And so it was really interesting to talk to people about what they perceived was happening with the hydrology and with the stream flow, and just got me thinking more and more about the role of soils in water provisioning, natural resources provisioning, filtration and pollutants, and all these kind of natural, or these great things that happen as you have soils, doing what they're supposed to do and functioning as they're supposed to. And so it really wasn't until I got to Virginia Tech as an assistant professor that I really got more into the agricultural side of things and the soil health side of things. And we were able to put together a proposal that was funded by the Natural Resources Conservation Service in what's known as a National Conservation Innovation Grant. And that was really focused on trying to measure and quantify soil health across the state of Virginia.
Well, I notice on your resume at Virginia Tech, you list as one of your areas of expertise water resources management. And that is a term that or a topic I'd like to ask you about. Should Virginia farmers be concerned about the future of water availability? We see this topic, which is of high concern on the West Coast, specifically California and a lot of the Rocky Mountain states. But in Virginia, it has not yet become an issue, at least that I'm aware of. Should farmers be concerned about water resource management in the future?
I think everywhere people should be concerned about water resource management, both from a water quality standpoint. So how clean is the water and what are we doing to affect that? And then more and more about the quantity, how much water is available and when is it available, the timing. I know when I talk to people working in the eastern part of the state and the coastal plain soils that are really sandy and don't necessarily hold on to a lot of water, they say that they're always a week or two of rain, a week or two of drought away from starting to get in trouble. So they need that continuous rainfall. And if those rainfall patterns start to change, then we could definitely be in a situation where we'd want some more resilience to survive those increasingly dry periods.
Dr. Stewart, I know a lot of your research is looking at how do we measure soil health. And so whether you're a farmer at a various scale or a backyard gardener, what are some of those indicators that we should be looking for?
So I definitely think that's an interesting question and a broad one. And so a few years ago, we really tried to figure out what people were measuring with soil health, because I'd go to a conference and we'd see people that were really interested in soil health and look at, okay, these people are measuring these things and these people over here are measuring these things. And so we did a systematic search through the scientific literature and just tried to pick out what actually was going into the science of soil health and what people were measuring. And so this was a work led by a postdoc working with me, and he and I came up with this list of 42 different indicators or classes of indicators that were associated with measuring soil health. And so broadly speaking, some were physical characteristics of soil, some were chemical, kind of availability, others were biological and ecological characteristics, and even things like how much crop yield is being produced or how much biomass you're getting in the plants. And so obviously, a lot of these measurements are very specialized. You need specialized lab equipment, specialized reagents, all these things. But a lot of it boils down to a few simple properties like how much organic matter is in the soil and how permeable is your soil, or how much water, how quickly or easily water will infiltrate into it, and then how that soil will hold on to the water and keep it there available for the plants.
And Ryan, with that, I think you have focused on soil physical properties, but there does seem to be more interest in the biology and how that affects, water resources and availability. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, I do have to clarify that I'm not a soil biologist, but I work with some very good ones. And so I'm able to pick up a few tricks of the trades from them. But soils really are these incredible resources in terms of biodiversity, biology. And so I've heard it said that if you took a teaspoon of soil, there could be, millions of different organisms in there, and even up to 1 million different unique species of organisms in that gram of soil. And so, there's more biodiversity probably in that teaspoon of soil than there is, mammals on planet Earth. And we really don't even understand who a lot of these organisms are, what they do, what their functions are. So there's a lot to learn there. And really, when we think about the organisms in the soil, they can range from single-celled microbes to earthworms or even larger fauna that are moving around and disturbing the soil, or rearranging it, or as in some cases, improving the soil. And so a lot of what we do in terms of practical applications in terms of soil health is think about how these organisms are affecting the function of the soil. And an example of this is we can take a sample of soil, we can air dry it, and then we re-wet it up and measure how much carbon dioxide comes out of that soil. And that's an integrated measure, and I don't know that anybody really understands biologically all the things that are happening and all the interactions, but it does tell us a lot about how healthy the soil is, and even things like how much nitrogen is available in that soil that could potentially be used by the crops as they're growing. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn more and more about this interaction between the biological characteristics of soil and the overall functioning and health of the soils.
We're talking today with Dr. Ryan Stewart with the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. And Dr. Stewart, final question from me, and it truly is out of my own curiosity. We chatted about this before the episode today, and it's on the topic of strip tillage, which is a new term to me, but I understand it's been around for years in the Virginia agricultural community, specifically, as you said, with cotton growers. There's a lot of research taking place. It was described to me as a cross between no-till and conventional tillage, but it has numerous benefits both for the environment and for crop yields. But can you enlighten me at least on what is strip tillage?
Yeah, so I think that's a good way to describe it, somewhere of a hybrid between no-till and a conventional till. But the idea is you want to minimize your tillage to the crop row and leave as much soil as possible undisturbed. And I think that goes back to one of the four of the soil principles: try to minimize disturbance of the soil. And we certainly have crops like cotton, tobacco, where you have to have some amount of soil disturbance to get a healthy crop. But the strip tilling is a way to kind of do what you need to do in terms of managing the row itself, whereas leaving the bulk of the soil undisturbed. And that can have all kinds of benefits, like encouraging more infiltration, or maybe maintaining more plant residue on the surface, which can help insulate the soil potentially, or store more of that moisture in the soil. So yeah, there's definitely a lot going on there, and that's an active area of research. For example, collaborating with Dr. Hunter Frame at the Tidewater Agricultural Research and Extension Center in Suffolk, Virginia, and he has a set of plots out here looking at interactions between these different tillage practices, including strip tillage, as well as different cover crop mixtures in there, and seeing what that means in terms of soil health.
Dr. Stewart, talking about management and the impact that management choices can have on soil health, but you also mentioned early in the podcast, you go from the Eastern Shore to the Shenandoah Valley, two very different soil types, and Virginia being so diverse in that sense. To what extent can you change soils with management? And again, I know that's a loaded question, but
I think that's a great question. Probably one of the more important questions in terms of what we're trying to do with these measurements of soil health and trying to better assess and quantify it. And so, I can speak to some of our current efforts in collaboration with the Virginia NRCS office. We recently got some funding from the National NRCS Soil and Plant Science Division to do what's known as a dynamic soil property assessment, where we are trying to measure how soil properties are changing as a response to management. So the idea is you start with a common soil series, and then you look at how different management practices affect it. And so we have some pilot projects both in the Shenandoah Valley, like you mentioned, Mary, as well as in the coastal plain of Eastern Virginia. And an interesting kind of preliminary finding we had was working in the Shenandoah Valley. We focused on some pasture systems with different management. And one of the things we measured was organic matter. And we found a couple of our sites which had 9 and 10, 11% organic matter, which are kind of off through the roof values. We were so I guess, shocked by it, we took some more samples and verified that those organic matter levels are really that high. So that's an example where the management is really helping probably drive up that organic matter compared to, some row crop fields nearby. I would expect would have lower organic matter concentrations.
And Ryan, building off of that, this idea of systems and a holistic approach to soil health, have you had recent sort of aha moments that have challenged you and inspired you recently as a researcher and teacher?
Yeah, so certainly that project I just talked about, seeing those organic matter concentrations, we just blew our mind. Like, wow, it's crazy that this is possible in these managed systems. So there is a lot of opportunity, I think, for farmers in general to build more soil health into their practices. But I think every day, I'm outside and get to play around in the soil. I learn something new, whether it's just, I didn't expect to see this rooting structure, or thinking about why the plant's looking healthier over here versus over here. Does it have something to do with the drainage of the water, or something with the soil properties itself? And so I think there's always so much to learn about soils, and they're just so infinitely fascinating, in my opinion.
One final question, and that is about additional resources. Where would you send our listeners to this podcast to get additional information? And I guess a wide, diverse array of resources, backyard vegetable gardeners, row crop farmers. Is the local extension office probably your first stop in every case?
The local extension office is always a good bet to start with. And if they don't know the specific answer, they can usually point you to somebody who does. Beyond that, the NRCS has resources available, and the SARE program, which is Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education, they have some really nice publications that are available, including, I'm trying to find the name, but building or better soils for better crops, building soils for better crops. Yeah. So they just came out with the 4th edition. I have the 3rd edition, and certainly dog-eared it in certain chapters just to see what other people have found out about how to build better soils.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest on this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. Dr. Ryan Stewart, School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you also, Mary and Eric.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes.
Thanks, Jeff.
And that is going to do it for this episode. For the Soil Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of Jason Shaw and Mr. Ruiz. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.